11 children appeared across 3 states, none with names, all with the same birthday, March 14th. They showed up at the edges of cornfields, behind dying churches, on the front steps of orphan homes no longer on any map. Each child was eerily silent, unnaturally calm, and carried the same crescent-shaped scar, just beneath the left collarbone. No fingerprints, no birth records. Blood that flowed slow, wounds that refused to bruise. They didn't cry. They didn't blink out of sync. And at night, in 3 different towns, people claimed to hear the same 3-note hum vibrating through the floorboards. Some said they were survivors of something forgotten. Others whispered, "They're not children. They're memories." What if memory doesn't live in the brain, but in breath, in copper, in salt? And what if it's not waiting to be remembered, but waiting to return? This is Salt Archive, a ritual horror buried in American folklore, lost time, and forbidden memory. If you lined them up, those 11 children, you'd think they were siblings, but they weren't. Not by blood, not by time, not by anything human. They appeared without warning during the final snow of 1847, spread across abandoned roads, chapel steps, and the frostbitten fields of the American Midwest. The first was found wrapped in an old cavalry coat outside Dogwood Hollow Church, curled in the shape of a question mark, eyes wide open. The second was left at a crossroads near Cold Elm Creek, standing barefoot on frozen dirt, holding a photograph no one had ever taken. By dusk, there were 11. All of them born on March 14th. All of them the same height, 4 feet, 6 inches. All of them with the exact same scar. No names, no parents, no shoes. But they didn't look lost. They looked placed. One local farmer described it best. They didn't arrive. They were installed. The sheriff tried to separate them, sent one child 40 miles south to Marlin, another east to Grenton. Within 2 nights, both were back, mud-caked, barefoot, silent, standing exactly where they'd been found. Then came the hum. Neighbors reported hearing a low-frequency 3-note melody from beneath their homes, always between 3:11 and 3:16 a.m. Dogs refused to enter the old churchyard. Candles would go out if placed within 6 feet of the children. No one could explain it, but no one dared to ask the children, because every time someone did, they all turned at once and smiled. The strangest thing about them wasn't how they looked. It was what they refused to do. They didn't eat. Not in the way children should. Plates of stew were left untouched. Bread dried out on windowsills. When asked if they were hungry, they tilted their heads, every single one, at the exact same angle. Some thought they were malnourished. Others thought they were trained. But on the evening of March 14th, everything changed. That night, Reverend Halpern gave each of the 11 a birthday gift, a cloth bundle wrapped in beeswax and twine. Inside was a simple token, a small wooden carving of a bird, a cross, or a pressed flower sealed in salt. They didn't unwrap them. They walked to the trees behind Dogwood Hollow and buried them. 11 holes, 11 exact depths. No one spoke a word. Mrs. Elsie Bruton, the schoolteacher, followed them. She waited until midnight and dug up the bundles. Inside one, she found something different. Not a token, but a note. A note that wasn't written in any known hand, and one that felt warm to the touch. It read, "Return prepared." She told her husband. She told the Reverend. Then she told the town. And the next morning, her front door was found wide open. The porch steps were still wet, and her boots were sitting neatly on the edge of the well. She was never seen again. That was the first disappearance. It wouldn't be the last. And none of the children ever asked where she went. What they did next, no one in the town could explain. But everyone remembered it the same way. 3 days after Miss Bruton vanished, The 11 children walked, without instruction, without sound, into the center of Dogwood Hollow's sanctuary. The bell above hadn't rung in 20 years, but at exactly 3:14 p.m., it let out a single toll. No one pulled the rope. Each child placed a single object at the front pew: a strip of copper wire, a button from a coat no one recognized, a milk tooth wrapped in cloth. Then, in perfect sequence, they sat. They all exhaled, at the same time, as if they were releasing someone else's breath. Pastor Halpern called it a coordinated stunt. Townsfolk weren't so sure. When asked what they were doing, one of the children finally spoke, not with words, but a sound. A 3-note tone, so low it made the stained glass quiver. Later that night, a letter was found nailed to the Reverend's door. The paper was damp with brine, the ink written in reverse, as if intended only for mirrors. No one admitted writing it. No one could decipher the full text. But 3 words were clearly readable beneath the salt stains. We remember first. That week, 2 more families fled town. One man drove his truck into the river with the engine running. His wife said he hadn't slept in 4 days. Said he kept hearing footsteps in the crawl space. But the sheriff checked. There were no footprints. Just 11 small handprints pressed into the floorboards. The first time someone tried to measure them, every clock in the chapel stopped. It was Reverend Halpern's idea. He'd grown tired of whispers and newspapermen circling like buzzards. So he asked the children to come forward, one by one, to be weighed, measured, and recorded for the church archive. The first boy stepped up. He wore a buttoned flannel, no shoes, and his scar was slightly pink from the cold. When he placed his hand on the scale, the needle didn't move. Halpern tapped the glass, recalibrated. Still nothing. They tried another child, then another. Same result. Even the measuring tape recoiled strangely, as if the fabric refused to stretch past 4 feet, 6 inches. The Reverend's assistant wrote in his journal that day, "It's like they're not made of mass, like they're not growing forward, but looping inward." That night, lightning struck the steeple. A fire broke out in the bell tower, but it didn't spread. When they checked the damage, they found 11 small burn marks on the beam, each spaced exactly 6 inches apart. No one knew how the children had gotten up there, or why one mark was deeper than the rest. Later, one of the boys was seen outside the hardware store, standing still for nearly 2 hours, staring at a broken thermometer. When the store owner approached, the child turned and said, "I'll remember this for you." He hadn't spoken before. He didn't speak again. And when asked what he meant, all 11 children tilted their heads, just like before, and exhaled together. That was the moment the town realized something wasn't just wrong. Something had already happened. The first time someone recognized one of them, it was from a memory they swore wasn't their own. In early April, nearly 3 weeks after the children appeared, a traveling nurse named Miriam Coyle arrived in Dogwood Hollow from Nebraska. She'd heard whispers, a town with no hospital but too many bandages. Her plan was to document, to assist, maybe to understand. But the moment she saw the boy with the crooked collar and copper wire bracelet, she collapsed. Not from shock, but from recognition. She said she'd seen him before. Not here. Not now. But 12 years earlier, in a house that never existed. She described the wallpaper. Deep red, with a curling fern pattern. The boy was younger, but identical. He had drawn a symbol on the floor in table salt. A symbol she couldn't remember when awake, but traced perfectly in her sleep. She was assigned to care for him. But he never spoke. Not once. Still, she heard him. In her dreams, in her kitchen. In the static hum of her radio when it flickered to life at 3:14 a.m. She started drawing the symbol again. On napkins. Inside books. On her own skin. She tried to leave town 3 days later. but her car wouldn't start. Neither would anyone else's. The mechanic said it was the salt in the air, like something had bloomed that wasn't supposed to bloom. That night, she walked barefoot back to the church. Witnesses said she looked calm, like someone returning home. They found her coat the next morning folded neatly on the church bench. Her shoes were placed in the exact center of the sanctuary, and carved into the wood below them, scorched into the grain, were 5 words. We're just replacing the forgotten. You ever look in a mirror and feel like you're late to something you already lived? That's how Mr. Carlton Yates described it. He ran the general store out on Hollow Ridge, a war veteran with a bad hip and no patience for ghost stories. He didn't believe the children were evil. He believed they were unplugged from something the rest of us forgot. On April 9th, just before sundown, Yates closed shop early. He told his wife he felt like something was walking just behind him, close enough to touch, but never casting a shadow. When he locked the door, he noticed his reflection in the glass. Except it wasn't his reflection. It was him, 12 years younger, with salt crusted around his lips and a little girl in his arms, a girl they never had. The image didn't move. It watched. It waited. And it whispered. Not out loud, but across the bone. He backed away. Fell. Cried out. His wife ran out from the house and found him collapsed, staring into a shattered storefront window. All he said was, "She sang to me. She sang all 3 notes." That night, he didn't sleep. Didn't eat. Just sat in the hallway staring at his wedding photo, mumbling the same thing. It already happened. It's just remembering me back. When Reverend Halpern visited the next day, he found the man standing barefoot in a ring of table salt, one hand pressed against the wall. He'd drawn something on it with his thumb. A circle. A smaller circle inside it. And beneath that, 3 dots in a perfect line. The same shape etched into the church pew days earlier. And this time, it was warm to the touch. It wasn't just memories being triggered. It was memories being rewritten. From the outside in. The 3rd confirmed case of altered recall came from Sarah Millis, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in Dogwood Hollow since 1958. She had no children. Never married. But on the morning of April 12th, she woke up to find a shoebox at the foot of her bed, filled with crayon drawings signed in her handwriting. But with a child's name she didn't recognize. Tom. Each drawing showed the same scene. A chapel, 11 children, and what looked like a woman kneeling with salt spilled from her mouth. Sarah was hospitalized that afternoon after she was found digging in her backyard with her bare hands. She told neighbors she was trying to find the memory before it found her. Doctors couldn't explain why her blood work showed elevated sodium levels, over 4 times the safe range, even though she hadn't eaten in days. What's more chilling? When they scanned her short-term memory, her readings mirrored those of trauma victims, but with one difference. The scan looped. A 30-second echo, repeating itself every 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Later that week, Reverend Halpern played a tape recording of the children's first church visit. Hidden beneath the ambient noise, he noticed something buried in the static. A faint voice repeating the same phrase over and over, too quiet for human ears, but visible in waveforms. It said, "You are not the first to forget." Sarah passed away 2 nights later, not from illness, from dehydration. Her hands were stained with salt, and her final note was scrawled across her hospital bedsheet. "If you see them again, don't answer. They're only asking to enter." At some point, the town stopped asking who the children were, and started asking what they were rewriting. By mid-April, residents began reporting the same impossible event. They were remembering things that never happened, together. 3 men at the feed store remembered fixing a roof in 1994. They agreed on the weather, the ladder, the joke one of them told about a rattlesnake in the mailbox. But no such roof ever existed. And one of the men had only moved to town in 2003. A mother said her daughter asked why they didn't go to the salt singing this year. when pressed. The girl described a candlelit procession where the townsfolk placed copper wire around the children and hummed in unison. The mother had no such memory, but 3 other families did. Reverend Halpern made an announcement: no more interaction with the children, no more eye contact, no more questions. But it was too late. At 3:16 a.m. on April 16th, every mirror in the church basement cracked inward, all at once. No seismic activity, no temperature shift, just a wave of fracture, as if the glass had exhaled. And the next morning, 11 new drawings were found in the chapel. Crude, childlike, but not signed by the children. They were signed by townspeople, people who had never learned to draw. Each drawing showed a house on fire, and at the center of the flames, a woman kneeling in salt. That woman hadn't arrived yet, but her name was written on the back of every picture: Elias Mercer. When the phones died, no one panicked. When the radios turned to static, people just blamed the storm. But when the children started standing in the road, blocking cars from leaving, that's when the fear turned physical. On the morning of April 19th, every line of communication in Dogwood Hollow failed simultaneously. Landlines hissed. Cell towers blinked out. The post office was locked from the inside. Its keys rusted mid-air. Families tried to flee. But the highway out of town was suddenly impassable, not by barricade, but by silence. 11 children spaced evenly across the asphalt, heads tilted, hands holding nothing. And yet every adult who approached swore they couldn't move forward. One man tried anyway. His truck passed the first child and immediately stalled. He stepped out to check the engine. When he turned back, the children were gone, but the road behind him was salt white and cracked, like it hadn't been paved in 100 years. Back in town, people stopped speaking, not out of fear, but because words felt borrowed, like the air wasn't theirs to use. At night, the breathing began, not from the lungs, but from the walls. From pipes, from mirrors, from the grain of old pews. It was rhythmic, tidal, like something remembering how to be alive. The Reverend wrote in his final note, "I don't think we're trapped in the town. I think the town is trapped in us." And then came the coughing. One by one, the townsfolk began coughing up grains of salt, fine at first, then coarse, bloodied, warm. No one had touched the sea in over 600 miles, but Dogwood Hollow had become tidal, and it was still rising. They weren't killing people, they were borrowing them. By April 21st, the town's water supply turned cloudy. Not brown, not red. White, as if someone had stirred salt into every pipe feeding every house. Dozens reported sore throats, hallucinations, voices in the drain. But there was no fever, no infection, just conversion. People began to mimic the children, not deliberately, instinctively. An elderly man was seen standing barefoot at the town square, holding copper wire like a rosary. A teenager started humming 3 perfect tones in the school hallway, except the school had been closed for weeks. Most disturbing, townsfolk started referring to memories that weren't their own. A woman claimed she missed the salt procession on the cliffs, but there were no cliffs in Dogwood Hollow. A postal worker handed Reverend Halpern a letter that hadn't been stamped, sealed, or written by anyone in town. It read, "One breath for the drowned, one for the buried, one for the forgotten." Then people stopped coughing. They started whispering. But it wasn't their own words they were speaking. It was something older, something in rhythm, something that timed itself to the waves that never reached this landlocked town. Late that night, a child who hadn't spoken in weeks approached the Reverend and took his hand. She smiled, then said, "I think we used to be you." And in that moment, he understood. The ritual wasn't summoning the dead. It was hollowing the living. No one remembered forgetting. but they started forgetting to remember. By April 23rd, the question wasn't, who are the children, anymore. It was, who are we, now? Entire family photos began changing, not vanishing, rewriting. In more than a dozen homes, pictures of two-child families now showed 3. Each new child had the same posture, head slightly tilted, hands behind their back, no reflection in the glass. When asked, parents hesitated. Some said, "He's always been with us." Others cried mid-sentence, unable to explain the names they suddenly remembered. Elias Mercer, a school counselor who had returned to town just days earlier, began recording her sessions. She wasn't treating students. She was treating parents who could no longer recognize their own voices on home videos. One mother watched her wedding tape and saw herself turn to the camera, smile, and say, "I am borrowed." She doesn't recall ever saying that. The tape has no cuts. Children in the chapel began writing names into salt circles, names of people still alive. And those people, hours later, would begin humming the 3 tones in perfect synchrony. The Reverend tried to destroy the pew carvings, burned them, but they reappeared. Deeper, wetter, pulsing. A doctor from out of town arrived and tried to examine the affected. He stayed one night. The next morning, he told Marin, "I had a dream about a memory I've never had. I was inside a man who wasn't me, but I remembered loving his daughter. Her name was June." That's when Marin froze. Because June was the name of her daughter. A daughter who died 3 years ago. And her photo had just reappeared on the mantle, still warm to the touch. You don't need to die to be replaced. You just need to forget yourself. Long enough for something else to remember you instead. By the final days of April, Dogwood Hollow stopped behaving like a town. It behaved like a body. A breathing, pulsing thing with salt for blood and memory for breath. The church bells rang at 3:14 a.m. Even though the ropes had been cut, doors opened in unison. Mirrors began showing not reflections, but choices. People would stare into the glass and see 2 versions of themselves. One they remembered, and one who wore the same clothes, same face, but held a child's hand. A child whose face was always blurred, and the moment they blinked, only one version would remain. Elias Mercer walked through town at dawn, documenting what she called memory bleeding. Street signs changed overnight. Hollow Ridge became Mercer's Hollow. The library shelves reshuffled into volumes no one remembered checking out. A title caught her eye. The Archive of Salt, Volume 15. There were no other volumes. She opened it. Inside were pages of her own handwriting, pages she had no memory of writing. Each one was addressed to someone named Elias. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in the town in 13 years. Elias Mercer, her husband, declared missing in the Gulf. And on the final page, a single sentence etched deep into the parchment. The body is not the vessel. The memory is. That night, 11 children stood in a circle at the chapel. Marin approached slowly. They parted to let her enter. She didn't ask what they were. She asked, "Which version of me do you want?" And one of them whispered, "The one who remembers the salt." It was never about the children. It was about what came through them. On the evening of April 30th, Marin returned to the chapel holding the salt-stained journal from volume 17. With trembling hands, she followed the handwritten instructions. One page detailed an active memory inversion. Kneel in a circle of salt. Breathe in for 11 counts. And forget something you love. She tried to forget the voice of her daughter, June. But something else left instead. Her own reflection. As the ritual progressed, the children hummed the same 3-note sequence. But this time, Marin heard lyrics beneath it. Words she had never learned, but understood as if they were native. We are the breath of those drowned beneath history. We are the memory that survived the body. We wear you to stay. The walls began to sweat salt water. The pews pulsed. The crucifix cracked. And then, Elias stepped out of the back room. Not older. Not aged. Exactly as he was the day he vanished. He looked at Maren with a face that recognized her. But not from life. From ritual. I didn't die, he said softly. I was overwritten. Maren tried to speak, but the salt in her mouth turned to stone. Elias placed a trembling hand on her cheek. I remember your grief. That's how I found my way back. And then he asked a question no widow should ever hear. Do you still remember what I looked like? Before the water? You didn't forget. You were remembered by something else first. By May 1st, the remaining residents of Dogwood Hollow started gathering at the chapel steps without knowing why. Entire families arrived barefoot. Some wore pajamas. Others carried nothing but old photographs, each photo warped, curling at the edges, as if resisting being seen. The Reverend tried to pray aloud, but his words came out in another language, a dead dialect from the Carolina coast last spoken in the 1700s. He collapsed moments later, bleeding from the ears. Inside the chapel, the air turned heavy with memory. People began whispering to walls, to furniture, to their own hands, confessions, regrets, stories that weren't theirs. One man screamed as he saw his own face reflected on 11 different surfaces, and in each one, he was weeping over a different gravestone. In the center aisle, someone placed a mirror on the floor. One by one, others looked down. Each saw a version of themselves kneeling in salt, surrounded by children who looked like theirs, but weren't. Maren stood at the pulpit and opened her journal again. But this time, the pages were blank. And then slowly, the words began to reappear, not ink, but salt, bleeding upward through the paper. They formed a single phrase, "What you love will find you first." The people began to cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. They were remembering memories they'd never lived. They were being remembered by something older than truth. And in unison, the entire chapel whispered one word. Again. The more you tried to remember who you were, the deeper something else remembered you instead. On May 2nd, the final convergence began. Not with screams or fire, but with silence. A silence so deep it swallowed names. People stopped calling each other by their real names. They used titles now. The one who sings. The one who returned. The vessel of June. Names that felt ceremonial. Assigned. Chosen. In their homes, mirrors began fogging over without condensation. And when wiped, they didn't show reflections. They showed scenes. Not from the past, but from possible pasts. A man saw himself holding a baby girl. He wept. He never had a child, but the girl whispered "Daddy" through the glass. His wife saw herself digging in the salt marsh, smiling. Her hands were covered in copper. She had no idea what she was burying, or what she was feeding. Maren stood outside the chapel, surrounded by the 11 children. She asked them one final question. What are we becoming? The youngest child took her hand and said, Not becoming. Remembering. At 3:16 a.m., the sky over Dogwood Hollow turned a soft gray. Not storm clouds. Not smoke. Memory fog. A physical mist. Thick, slow, and humming in 3 tones. Inside the chapel, every person had collapsed into stillness. Eyes open. Breathing synced. Hands pressed to their chests. Whispering names. Not their own. In that moment, the town didn't disappear. It shifted. Maren looked down and realized her hands weren't hers anymore. They were younger, smaller, salt wet. They didn't come to take your body. They came to borrow your story. At 3:18 a.m., the town of Dogwood Hollow ceased appearing on digital maps. GPS glitched, phone signals warped, postal records were wiped. It was as if the town had unremembered itself. But inside the chapel, everyone remembered everything, too clearly. Marin walked among them. No one moved, no one blinked. But they were breathing, speaking in low unison, reciting names of people long dead, in perfect reverse chronology. David, Ruth, Elias, Halpern, Caleb, Mercy, Esther, June. The 11 children formed a ring around her. In their palms were objects that no longer belonged to them. A lock of Marin's childhood hair, Elias's dog tags, a baby tooth she buried 20 years ago. She fell to her knees. Her voice cracked. "What are you doing to us?" One child stepped forward, holding a salt-stained photograph. In it, Marin, holding June. But she was the child, and June was the adult. "We are rebalancing," the child said. "We gave you life. Now, we take memory." Then the pews creaked, the walls pulsed, the altar began to bleed brine. And from behind the pulpit, Elias emerged again. This time, not alone. Behind him stood versions of Marin. Dozens, younger, older, twisted, holy, monstrous, all of them whispering, "You are the echo, not the voice." And in that moment, Marin realized the final truth. She hadn't been fighting to save the town. She'd been stalling the moment she'd be remembered back into place. Some rituals don't end when the candles go out. Some just switch hosts. A week after the event, a FEMA drone flew over the region once known as Dogwood Hollow. All it captured was a fog-covered basin, flickering in and out of satellite sync. No roads, no ruins, just one structure, barely visible, a chapel with no door. The town's name was quietly removed from census records. Survivors, if they could be called that, were relocated, but none remembered why. One woman in Maine screamed during a sleep study when asked her name. She only replied, "Salt, elsewhere." A 4-year-old boy in Nevada began humming a 3-note melody and drawing spiral salt rings on his bedroom walls. His parents were both born in Dogwood Hollow. They had no memory of it. Elias Mercer's body was never found, but a journal surfaced in an antique shop in Illinois. It was blank, until touched. Then, in bleeding salt script, words began to appear. "The memory wants to live." Since then, similar journals have been found in Kansas, Oregon, and Vermont. All carry the same watermark. Volume 2. None of the shops claim to have stocked them. All who've touched them report the same dream. 11 children, a chapel, a voice whispering, "Breathe in for 11. Forget something you love." And the final question scribbled on the last page of each volume: if you were overwritten, would you know? Not everyone needs to enter the chapel. Sometimes, the chapel enters them. Since the Dogwood Hollow event, subtle phenomena began appearing across 13 states. All were dismissed as isolated oddities, but they shared a rhythm. In Raleigh, North Carolina, a second-grade teacher reported 11 students simultaneously humming a melody she couldn't forget even after covering her ears. In Boulder, Colorado, a therapist quit her job after 3 patients in 1 week described the same dream. A girl with salt in her eyes asking, "Do you remember me yet?" In Wichita, Kansas, a retired firefighter dug up his backyard without knowing why. He uncovered an old photograph. In it, he stood beside a chapel he swore he'd never seen before. But he was smiling. These aren't random. They're residues, echoes of a memory too large to be buried. And the children, those 11 salt-bound figures, seem to be appearing more frequently in sketches, dreams, security footage glitches. One thing unites these witnesses. None had ever visited Dogwood Hollow. but all, somehow, remember it. And those who forget? They're the ones most vulnerable. Because the ritual isn't finished. It was never about the town. It was about scale. The salt doesn't need to spread. It just needs to be remembered. So the question becomes, is your memory still yours? Or just the next vessel? You can quarantine a virus. You can't quarantine memory. By August, internal reports began to circulate within 3 federal departments. The CDC noted a spike in children under 12 reporting non-linear memory episodes, recalling events in reverse, or describing funerals of people who were still alive. The Department of Education flagged 23 public schools in rural regions where students, completely uncoached, began drawing the same chapel, one with no doors, 11 windows, and a copper altar. Meanwhile, a coalition of Protestant churches across the Midwest started issuing private memos about sudden language fractures among clergy. One pastor in Ohio collapsed mid-sermon after repeatedly chanting, "The memory is sovereign, the memory chooses." None of these anomalies were ever made public. All were labeled as isolated psychological episodes. But behind closed doors, a different phrase was used. Salt echo syndrome. The salt doesn't enter your bloodstream. It enters your narrative. And once it does, everything you thought was yours, your childhood, your grief, your faith, can be rewritten. That's what makes this ritual unstoppable. It doesn't erase the truth. It just replaces the author. So when a nurse in Montana wakes up with 11 names tattooed along her spine, when a preacher in Alabama forgets his daughter's face, but remembers the name Elias Mercer, ask yourself this. What if you're already part of the story, just waiting for your chapter to begin? If you remember this story clearly, you were never supposed to. This isn't just a tale. This is a transcription of something older, not written, recalled. The 11 children didn't just vanish into myth. They became mimetic anchors, living vessels of a ritual designed not to kill, but to continue. Salt binds memory. Memory binds identity. And the more people who hear this, the more stable the pattern becomes. If you've made it this far into the video, stop. Not to click away, but to breathe. Breathe in for 11. Exhale without a name. You've been exposed to the shape now, the rhythm, the cadence, the imagery, copper, salt. The date March 14th. The name Elias Mercer. The sound of 3 tones in your left ear. They're harmless separately, but together, they form the door. And by listening, you've already knocked. Some viewers have reported seeing fog on their window the next morning. Some hear children whispering just before they sleep. Most dismiss it. They forget. Which is exactly how the ritual survives. So before this ends, ask yourself, what was your earliest memory? Are you sure it was yours? Because the ritual only needs one thing to continue, a witness. And now, you are one, you made it. And if you're still here, it means the story didn't scare you away. It chose you to carry it. Not everyone will feel what you just felt. Not everyone will remember. But maybe you saw something, heard something, felt that familiar chill at the base of your spine. If you did, write it down. Drop it in the comments. Because sometimes, sharing is how we contain what we can't understand. Save this video. Rewatch it when the dreams come back. Share it if someone you know hums 3 notes without knowing why. And if you want to stay close to stories the world tries to forget, subscribe. You are now part of the Salt Archive. We remember, so others don't have to.